Support for the Living Well with MS podcast is provided by Overcoming MS, a global charity registered in the United States, United Kingdom and Australia, whose mission is to educate, support and empower people with MS in evidence-based lifestyle and medication choices that can improve their health outcomes. Please visit our website at www.overcomingms.org to learn more about our work and hear directly from people around the world about the positive impact overcoming MS has made on their lives. Now, on to today's episode. This is a special episode of the podcast dealing with the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic and how it affects people with MS. Please be aware that the knowledge about this virus is changing rapidly, and we are presenting the best advice that we have at the time of recording, but you should check information regularly, including the links in the show notes, to ensure that you have the latest advice. Joining me on today's episode is Dr. Jonathan White, medical advisor and event facilitator for Overcoming MS. So, welcome Johnny White. I should say actually welcome back because you've been on a previous podcast. I was hoping to welcome you back on happier times, but we have the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic, and you're here to give us some more information about that. So welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, great to be back, but as you say, under rather unfortunate circumstances, very worrying and troubling time, and hopefully we can sort a few things out between the two of us for the next little while and understand a bit more about this coronavirus pandemic that we're all having to deal with at the minute.
Yeah, so we'll start off with this, a very basic question.
Yeah.
What is coronavirus or COVID-19, but to be more specific?
Yeah, so coronavirus is actually just is a group term for a type of virus. So corona is a crown, and essentially it's a virus which has the little spikes around the outside that look like a crown. So that's just a general term for a type of virus. This specific disease that we're talking about is COVID-19, coronavirus disease, because it was found in 2019, the last day of 2019. And the actual virus, so that's the clinical disease, is COVID-19. The virus itself is SARS-CoV-2, is what the virologists are now calling it. So coronavirus is, in general terms, and please remember and forgive me, I'm not a virologist, I'm an obstetrician, so my general working knowledge of viruses is coughs and colds. But in essence, the coronavirus is one of the cold viruses. There probably are 7 that we know of, and the 2 that most people would be aware of would be SARS, which was in 2002, and I think killed about 770-ish people, and then MERS in 2014, which was released and killed about 850 people. So they generally jump from animals to humans. So SARS we think came from bats, MERS we think came from camels, believe it or not, in the desert. And this particular COVID-19, we think, and there's a lot of uncertainty about this, but it seems that it originated originally in an illegal animal market in Wuhan in the Hubei province of China, and probably coming from bats, but we don't know that for sure just yet. So yeah, that's the sort of the basics about coronavirus. The one thing that probably most people have heard, but I think is worth reiterating, for the vast majority of people, this is a mild self-limiting illness. We think about 80% of people will either have no symptoms or mild symptoms that will last on average between sort of 7 and 14 days. But it's in the remaining 20% that we really worry that it can cause a very severe clinical disease. And they talk about a sort of 5% severe, as in needing critical or intensive care, and between probably 0.73% chance of mortality if you develop the clinical disease. So this is not something to be ignored, despite what you see with teenagers going into shops and licking Coke bottles. This is not something that just attacks the elderly. Everybody needs to be mindful, vigilant, and aware of this and following their local measures that are designed to reduce the spread and incidence of this disease.
Okay, so I was going to say, what are some of the early signs that you might have contracted coronavirus?
Yeah,
and sorry, when I say coronavirus on this podcast, we'll use that as a term for COVID-19.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The two are being used pretty much interchangeably. So The symptoms tend to develop with between 2 and 14 days after you've been exposed. So they think on average about an up to 14-day incubation period. In the United Kingdom, where I am at the minute, the two big symptoms that we talk about are a new persistent dry cough. So that's not a cough that you've had for months on end, but it's a new persistent, and it's very distinctively dry rather than productive. It doesn't produce a spit or a sputum. And the other thing that is often described as a fever, so in centigrade that's over 37.8 or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Other associated ones which aren't so diagnostic but are certainly mentioned and associated would be fatigue. So and many of us with MS can relate to that one. So very extreme fatigue and muscle pain, or myalgia as it's sometimes known, shortness of breath or chest tightness. And just in the last couple of days, a new one that is certainly being investigated is the fact that a lot of people lose their sense of taste and smell in the days before they develop symptoms. For some people, that is their only symptom, is a loss of sense of taste and or smell. So those are the main and most common things that people are complaining of so far.
Okay, one of my friends actually has been through this, or it ended up with his whole family contracting it. And he said it did feel like you needed to cough almost on every breath. It really was. When they say persistent, you feel like you need to cough the whole time.
There's a lot of paranoia about is this a persistent cough, but to be clear, things like clearing your throat the odd time or having a tickle at the back of your throat is not coronavirus typical symptom. As you say, it is an unrelenting persistent cough, and it's dry. It doesn't bring up anything. It's sore. Your throat feels like you've got nails at the back of it, or you're coughing through glass. And some people also describe an intensely sore throat as another symptom that's associated often with the cough. So yes, it's not just a tickle or clearing your throat. It's much, much worse than that.
So now, obviously, we're both in the UK, but this is for a global audience, so it might be slightly different depending on where you are in the world. But Indeed. What are some of the key steps that you should take if you think you have COVID-19? So
I think probably regardless of whether or not you have MS or not, or where you are in the world, the first thing, if you think that you have the clinical illness, is to socially distance yourself, or self-isolate, in fact, if you think you have the symptoms. And it depends on where you are as to what the advice is, but in general terms, if you live alone, you need to self-isolate for 7 days. So you shouldn't be outside except for in your garden or backyard if you have an outside space, but you should not be in contact with anybody, even the postman or mailman delivering your letters. You shouldn't be going to the shops to collect your food parcels. It should be coming to you and left at your door. You must not be in contact with people. That's the first thing to say if you do. If you think that you have the coronavirus. If you live with other people, if you have a family or people in your home, then that advice, I can only speak from the UK perspective, but to me it makes perfect sense that needs to be 14 days, because obviously everybody in the house, they may not get it, but if they are going to get it, they won't all get it on the same day. That's not the way, unfortunately, these things work. So it needs to be 14 days that the family are self-isolating. And as I say, that means essentially locking down the home and having no contact.
So you're basically treating the family as a unit.
Correct. So anybody in your house, this thing is unbelievably infectious. So, we talk about, you'll probably like this, Jeff, as a data analyst, but the R0 is this statistical idea that's bandied around to do with how infective something is. So in general terms, the seasonal flu infects, its R0 number is 1.5. So if I have the flu, I will infect 1.5 people with the flu. With coronavirus, that number is probably somewhere between 3 and 4. So people are talking about 3.5. So it is incredibly infectious. And you must stay away from people if you think you have the symptoms.
And so you mentioned social distancing and self-isolation. What's what are the two terms, and what's the difference between those? The one I've already mentioned is self-isolation, which means you're at home, you're not leaving home except to do exercise, either in your garden or in the home, but you're not in contact with anybody.
unless people that live in your house, obviously it's difficult for you to avoid them. But even in that circumstance, you should avoid them as best as possible. So if you can, sleep in a separate bedroom, use a separate bathroom, or use a bathroom after everybody else has used it at that day, and clean down the surfaces of everything that you use. That's the self-isolation model, essentially locking yourself away. Social distancing is I suppose, one step, so the Diet Coke, I suppose, version of it, which is you're minimizing all social contact as best you can. And this is what we should all be doing in areas where the virus is spreading rapidly. So, and we're talking about a quarter of the world's population, I think, at the minute, are in some way practicing a form of this. So this is only leaving the home when you're going to work, and that's work if you have to go, if it's an essential work, or if it can't be done from home. When you're going out shopping for essentials, so this isn't browsing for new shoes or clothes. This is shopping for the essential foods and things that you need, and medicines, for example. You can leave the home to exercise, but you should be doing that in a way that is, again, minimizing all social contact and proximity to people. So depending where you are, the advice may be different, but we're usually saying between at least 1 meter, but ideally 2 or more meters gap between people to stop the spread of this condition. And it's massively important. It's not just something we say because we have no better solution to the problem, despite what some people may say. There's good evidence for this. In the Spanish flu in 1918, which wiped out tens of millions of people after the First World War, it was very, very prevalent in America, and there were 2 cities had 2 very different approaches and very different results. In Philadelphia and St. Louis, and in Philadelphia, I think they didn't practice social distancing. St. Louis did, and the cases were astronomically higher in the areas that did not socially distance. So this is a very effective technique for preventing the spread of this virus.
Okay, so obviously this is a podcast for people with MS. So specifically, is it more dangerous if you have a condition like MS and then develop COVID-19?
So that's a very difficult question to answer because this is a new virus. We don't know. So there's obviously a caveat to this. What we think at present is you're not more likely to get COVID-19 just by virtue of having MS. So MS itself doesn't mean you're more likely to get COVID-19. I suppose the area where it becomes a little more tricky is that many people with MS, and that's mainly people with relapsing remitting MS, therapy, so DMD or DMT, and those by their nature are designed to either modulate or suppress the immune system. MS is an autoimmune condition, so the treatments, a lot of them are aimed at either changing the way the immune system operates or by actually turning it down in quite a gross way. Gross not being offensive, gross being large, if you follow my meaning. But so yes, MS can have an effect on COVID-19 by virtue of the fact of the treatments that we use for it. I suppose the only other caveat to that would be that we know that generally this disease is worse in those people who are elderly, and we usually talk about the over 70s. So people with MS who are older may be more susceptible. And I suppose if you had other underlying health conditions, generally those are severe respiratory or cardiovascular diseases, so not necessarily MS. But if you had very severe MS and you did have, for example, swallowing difficulties, that may impact on your risk of COVID-19 because you're more likely to choke and to aspirate on your on food and saliva and sputum, and that may increase your risk of developing the condition. But generally speaking, MS on its own does not increase someone's risk of developing coronavirus.
But the other way round, presumably developing coronavirus could trigger a relapse in MS.
Absolutely, yes. So the reverse is definitely true. So if you have MS, we know that there are things that increase your risk of a relapse, and infection is certainly one of those. So if you have a severe systemic infection, that is going to significantly increase your risk of relapse, yes. So whilst MS may not directly affect the coronavirus definitely can affect your MS. So yes, you're absolutely right on that.
So people with MS should be particularly conscious of of
They should
social
be.
distancing and self-isolating.
They should absolutely, and that depends on where you live as to what your government's guidance is on that. But as a general rule, I think people with MS should be socially distancing as much as is physically possible. They should work from home if that's possible for them. They should avoid public gatherings. They should avoid public transport. And there's probably a small group of MS people with MS that should actually, rather than socially distance, they should self-isolate. And I would say that those people are those that have had a recent stem cell transplant, if they've recently had a course of alemtuzumab or Lemtrada, as it's sometimes called, or recently had cladribine or Mavenclad, then they probably should be self-isolating, because those are 3 therapies that will significantly alter your immune system, and they probably would increase your risk. Although we don't fully understand that yet, but it seems sensible that they would increase your risk of developing coronavirus.
Yeah, so I wanted to go through some of the DMTs, and there's a link to a site that we'll put in the show notes from a neurologist who we've had on the podcast called Gavin Giovannoni, who's put a site specifically for COVID-19 and MS, and he's grouped up the DMTs into risk categories, and I just wanted to go through that because there are so many now. I mean, that is actually one of the good things about MS treatments, is there really is a huge choice of treatments.
Yes, and developing all the time.
Well, yeah, and so he's mentioned that there's a very low risk category for COVID-19, which was interferon betas, betaferon, Avonex, so on, Capaxone, Albagio are all very low risk. You should definitely continue treatment. Safe to start the treatment and continue treatment if you're doing it. No problem at all. There's a low risk category, Tecfidera, Tesabri, and again, probably safe to start the treatment. Certainly continue treatment. There's always a risk. Tecfidera can cause your lymphocyte count to go low, and that would, but that's being monitored anyway. I was on Tecfidera and taken off it because my lymphocytes were low, so that's monitored anyway. And then we get on to the sort of ones which are potentially potential problems. So they have an intermediate category, which is Gilenya, ocrelizumab, and Mavenclad. And currently saying that it's probably okay to start the treatment and you should continue treatment, and those shouldn't necessarily cause problem. If you have a COVID-19 infection, you might want to temporarily suspend or delay treatment of those. And so again, no major risk there. And then it does go on to, as you mentioned, the ones where there could be an issue. So one of those, Novatrone, I think that's really just coming onto market, isn't it, and not widely used. So that wouldn't be very commonly used at all. That's a very sort of end of the line, very, very risky treatment. Novatrone wouldn't really, but certainly, that's not something that's commonly used. But there are some which are much more commonly used. In that bracket. So then it comes on to so that one it does say you shouldn't start treatment and you should suspend dosing, and then Lemtrada, which is what I have, which is I take particular interest. Which is not safe to start treatment. If you are taking it, you should suspend dosing. That with that specifically, I mean, if people aren't aware, it's basically a treatment that you have 1 year apart, typically just 2 rounds, but sometimes 3. And if you've had the first round, then it's saying you can delay it. It's typically a year apart, but there's absolutely no reason it couldn't be 18 months. So you would delay that. Now, the issue comes when I've had the second round, but I had it last May, and so I was somewhat conscious because my lymphocytes, the last blood test I had were at 0.56, which is low, and the advice is they think you need a 0.8 to really protect you from this, so it's low, and I was expecting to get a letter from my health service to say you're at particular risk and you need to, they call it shielding, which is like
It's reverse quarantine, isn't it?
Yeah, it's self-isolation plus, basically. It's isolating you from the rest of your family and everything. So I was expecting this, but then actually they said, well, even with that, it's only within the first few months. Once you're 6 months post your last infusion, then your immune system is protecting you enough. So even with that, not to worry overly. Obviously, I know that I'm at an increased risk, and I'm isolating with my family, but don't panic.
No, absolutely. So that's the first thing to say, is that nobody needs to panic about this. And the other thing to say is that no one should stop taking any of their MS treatments before they've spoken to their MS team, because that could do you significant harm. Your risk of relapse if you suddenly stop your treatment is higher. And also with certain treatments, for example, Tysabri or with fingolimod or Gilenya, you have a risk of rebounds where you actually end up with worse symptoms than when you started. So nobody should stop this off their own bat. And I understand and I appreciate that it could be difficult to actually physically get to speak to your MS team at the minute. But the most important thing you can be doing is the self-isolating, the protection measures that we've discussed, rather than just stopping everything on your own, because that is not the way to deal with this.
And the final one is HSCT, hematopoietic
stem cell transplantation. Yeah. So yes, and that's a very very aggressive treatment for MS, generally done in the setting of a clinical trial, or in some centres, or with other people travelling to foreign countries and to different healthcare systems to achieve that. That's essentially a bone marrow transplant. It's completely destroying your immune system and restarting it. So that's the one that's an absolute, you must postpone that treatment. If you've just recently had that treatment, it's likely that you will be in a hospital setting anyway until you're safe to recover. But even if you are recently discharged from hospital, having had the stem cell transplant, you need to be extremely, extremely careful. And that really is the shielding measure, self-isolation plus, if you like, as a way of protecting yourself from this.
And I just wanted to come back to Lemtrada. Actually, one thing I've spoken to my personal specialists, because people who have had Lemtrada are on 5 years of monthly blood and urine tests.
Correct.
And I said, so should I go into hospital to have my bloods done? He said, absolutely, you must go into hospital to have your monthly bloods.
Yes.
So there are secondary risk factors, particularly thyroid issues with Lemtrada, and they are potentially very, very dangerous, well, life-threatening dangerous, but they're very easy to treat. So they said that the risk of you having a thyroid condition that potentially could kill you is actually higher than the risk of COVID-19 killing you. So you absolutely must still do that, but just to do it in as isolating a way as possible. So it may be that you don't go into hospital. It may be you go into a GP surgery. It may be that you can get someone to come out to you to do your blood tests, but don't stop having your blood tests done.
No, and nobody should stop their routine drug monitoring. That's absolutely correct. It's really, really important that we are monitoring. For, as you say, the side effects of most of these things are generally treatable either by changing the treatment or stopping the treatment, or by treating the new secondary autoimmune condition that develops. As you say, thyroid is a common one. And if you don't recognize them, then they can cause problems. It is very, very important that people are still engaging in the regular monitoring settings. And I'm sure that MS teams around the world at the minute, as in many, many conditions in healthcare settings, are furiously trying to work out how they do that. But it is massively important that you do continue to have the tests that you would normally have done. Yeah, absolutely.
And more generic appointments, would you still attend hospital appointments, meet your MS nurse or MS physio, or whatever team you have?
I think in the weeks and months immediately to come, a lot of the appointments that we're going to be seeing in in the MS setting are going to be remote and digital. They're going to be either over the phone or via Skype, rather than face to face. Because actually, you can learn a lot from somebody's MS just by talking to them. Yes, okay, examination is relatively important, but even that you can do a lot of over, a video call. So I think the amount of face to face probably should be limited, and probably will, as resources are moved and altered in the health service that's required. But if you are asked to come to the hospital to attend your neurologist, then I think that you probably should. You should certainly speak to them if you're concerned about coming, rather than just not going. I think that it's really, really important that we continue to engage with the normal things that are important in our healthcare. There's a tendency to focus absolutely everything on coronavirus now, and undoubtedly that has to happen to a greater or lesser degree, but there is definitely the potential for harm if people with conditions are not managed appropriately, during the face of this.
So another thing I wanted to cover, because obviously we're talking about overcoming MS protocols. So it's not just, a lot of people consider it a diet, but it's not just a diet. There's also the mindfulness part of it and the exercise part. And so we're in a situation now, the mindfulness part, where there's a barrage. When you put the news on, there is no other news, because there's no sport at all.
Nope, nothing else is happening in the world.
No, so there's pretty much no other news. So it can be. I mean, my mother she's very worried about it. She's I'm trying. She's saying it's so bleak, and because you're stuck and isolated, and all the news is all about this, and there's I think hopefully months down the line we'll be starting to get more positive news, as obviously, like China have they're sort of coming out the other end, and there will be a time when we start to come out the other end and it'll become more positive. But at the moment it's quite negative news. So how do you keep a sound mind, would be the first question. Is there anything we can do?
Well, I was thinking about this yesterday, and actually I believe as a community, as a group of people, OMSers are uniquely equipped to deal with situations like this. So, we have a condition that provides a huge amount of uncertainty in our day-to-day lives, and we have to deal with that. Some of us have been dealing with it for months, some for years. So it teaches us resilience. Whether we like it or not, we've had to deal with an awful lot, most of us. So I think that our general mindset is strong in that sense, but also we are extremely fortunate that we have got a worldwide digital community already. For many people, they're having to learn new ways of doing things and connecting. Well, look around at the OMS community. We've been doing this way, and it's improving, day by day almost. So we have a huge community out there to support each other, and I think that's massively important. As you say, self-care in times like this has never been more important. There's this phrase about terror scrolling, where you just can't stop yourself from looking at your phone or tablet, and you're just almost more horrified with every time you swipe your finger. And I think it's really important that you do set limits and barriers to yourself to give you that space. And so for me, the first thing I do is, the only news I ever watch or look at now is the daily briefing in the UK at 5:00, and other than that, I don't look at the news, and I've deleted those apps off my phone because they're just so unhelpful. It's often without appropriate context. Some of it might be factually incorrect. There might be opinion involved, as is probably the case with some American outlets currently, certainly. So that's the first thing to do. Is I've just given myself space, and I've deleted those things. I sort of take it that if something important happens, I'm going to hear about it one way or another when it comes to this. I'm absolutely, mindfulness is a part of my daily routine anyway, but it used to be sort of, I'd try and do my 20 to 30 minutes once a day. I'm now trying to do that first thing in the morning as a morning meditation, and last thing at night before I go to bed. And I think that's really, really important. And of course, the OMS website has endless resources regarding that, but there's so many apps, and it's great to see that so many of those things are temporarily free, and they're giving us that resource, which normally has a subscription cost. So I think there are certainly positives, many of them, coming out of this situation, that being one of them. I think also, as you said, for many of us, we can't get out anymore, and that's very frustrating, but you can and you must still exercise. So when I left the living room this morning, my wife and son were busy doing a YouTube PE class together. And I...
This is, so in the UK, this is a huge thing at the moment. There's this it's available to everyone, actually, so it's
absolutely,
probably, we should advise this.
We should, Joe Wicks is a guy in the UK who advocates, who's a sort of fitness coach, life coach, teaches a bit about nutrition as well, and he's got a free daily class for kids. But I tell you what, it looked like pretty hard work when I saw Jenny doing it this morning. And there's loads of those. So I go to a regular Pilates class at home, and unfortunately that's obviously had to be cancelled, but that resource has been put online for us once a week, so we can still get our class. But there's many of them that are free and easily available. If you type it into YouTube or search in Google, you'll find many things. And another thing I think that's really, really important, if we talk about distancing ourselves from media and social media as well, talking about self-care and meditation as well as exercise, eating well is really, really important. I know that we talk about that being a cornerstone and the key pillar of OMS anyway, but at times like this, it is very tempting to just go into the freezer and stick on something that maybe you would eat very, very infrequently as a slight treat on the OMS program. But good nutrition and eating well is incredibly important for your physical and mental well-being at times like this. This is just, we're in a bit of a war zone at the minute, and we have to do all we can to look after ourselves and feed body and mind.
I want to come back to diet in a second, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention one other thing about the sort of a sound mind. And obviously we're isolating, and humans are naturally social creatures.
Absolutely.
And there's an OMS circles program, so that basically local groups can get together. And so there's a circle where I live, and periodically we meet up in a cafe and discuss how we are and everything. And it's nice to get together. It's very, even my wife, she doesn't fully appreciate what I'm going through because she's not going through it. But these are people who are going through exactly the same as me, and it's good to have that connection. So obviously the meetings aren't happening, but what we've done is set up a slightly broader group. It's actually three local circles have got together and set up a WhatsApp group. It's really just socially chatting, really, with people who are in exactly the same situation as you. So you can keep social contact without physical contact.
Absolutely.
I think it's important as well. A lot of people are using FaceTime or Skype or whatever video system, and they're getting in touch with their relatives. I mean, certainly elderly relatives, my mother, my in-laws. We're actually communicating more. I'm speaking more to my brother at the moment because I'm not speaking to other friends. So you can keep in touch by telephone, by Skype, by whatever digital communication method you have, and we can socialize. So I would encourage people, if it's a good idea to connect with an OMS circle, even though they're geographic. That's almost irrelevant at the moment. But joining in with groups with other people, just to have a chat really is a good thing to keep your mind. Keep that social aspect of your mental side effective.
Just because you're self-isolating doesn't mean that you have to be isolated yourself. You're absolutely right. I have spoken to my family and FaceTime my family more in the last 2 weeks than I probably have in the last 6 months. Not my, obviously, family that I live with, but I mean my wider family circle. And, we've been in touch with elderly neighbours, making sure that they have all that they need. They've actually been in touch with us too to make sure that we have all that we need. And while undoubtedly this is a very, very difficult time, there are some real positives coming out of it, in sense of the act of kindness and compassion that we see. And it does warm the heart when you need it most to see the efforts that some people are going to try and help themselves, their neighbours and the wider community. So there is some good to be seen if you look for it.
Yes, and there's fantastic. I think this is in most areas. There's groups set up to help you if you do have to isolate. If you say you've had HSCT or something where you really do need to properly shield. People are setting up local groups where they will go and get shopping for you and bring it to your house. Obviously, leave it outside your front door, but we can do all those sort of things. So, sorry, you'd mentioned diet. So I had a question I asked to sort of the groups I'm involved with. Did they have any questions to ask? One of them was that in the OMS book, George Jelinek says not to take multivitamins. And does this advice still stand during the pandemic if you're struggling to get enough nutrients from the food, because there are shortages in shopping, so you may not be able to get the full range of foods that you would typically get. And if you think you aren't getting a full range of nutrients from your food at the moment, would you then take a multivitamin, was the question.
So generally speaking, I wouldn't take a multivitamin. Even if you can't get exactly what you would normally eat, by virtue of the fact you're eating, specifically in OMS, the whole food plant-based diet, plus or with or without seafood, you're very likely to be covering all the basic micronutrients, and it's very, very unlikely in the short to medium term that you're going to become deficient in any one particular vitamin. I think and this isn't sort of peer-reviewed medical evidence as such, but I think if you were going to take any vitamin at the minute, ensuring that you're taking an appropriate dose of vitamin C or vitamin C would be important. We generally talking about that in the winter time anyway to prevent coughs and colds and things, but there is some evidence that vitamin D or vitamin C, sorry, I'm just force of habit saying vitamin D, but vitamin C probably does have an effect on the immune system's response to viruses, and it certainly in the short to medium term is not going to do any harm. So I would definitely continue my vitamin D. I would certainly continue my vitamin B12 if I was wholly vegan, and I would possibly think about adding in some vitamin C, but I don't think for most people that they will require to take a multivitamin. And please remember that generally taking multivitamins, there has been studies to show that taking vitamins without a specific reason does increase slightly our all-cause risk of mortality. So just throwing multivitamins as a general problem isn't always going to be the answer on that one. Okay,
and you mentioned vitamin D as well. Yeah. Is that there's been some talk that potentially, I know it was mentioned maybe as far back as Spanish flu, they think that people might have done better at when they're out in the sunshine. Is there a potential positive benefit? I mean, we're taking vitamin D because it's part of our protocol, but is there a potential positive for the COVID-19 side of things as well?
Yeah, potentially. This is extremely interesting. So we're starting to see little snippets of this coming out of China, because obviously they have the most experience in this. Theoretically, it certainly makes sense. So we know that vitamin D is a very potent immunomodulator, so it has a very important effect on balancing the immune system, so the pro and anti-inflammatory sides of the immune system. If you think of two sides of a seesaw, it's very, very good at turning that balance back to the anti-inflammatory side of things. And we think in COVID-19 or coronavirus that a lot of the people who become extremely unwell is potentially not due to the virus directly itself, but rather the immune system's response to the virus. And people may have heard of this term, the cytokine storm, which is essentially where the body responds to the virus by turning up the levels of the pro-inflammatory little chemical messengers to a very, very high level. And it's a lot of that cascade that does the damage specific to the lungs. So if you follow the theory that vitamin D is a very potent sort of balancing act of the immune system, and it helps to put things back in balance, then it would stand to reason that perhaps it would be beneficial. And there is some evidence to say that vitamin D may be a benefit with coronavirus. Of course, for us in the OMS program, our vitamin D levels will obviously be higher anyways. You can't up them overnight, so it's not like we go out and get our vitamin D levels up to normal within 24 hours. But we should take solace and comfort in the fact that it's likely for us who've been monitoring our vitamin D and taking vitamin D for periods of time, that may be a protective benefit in coronavirus. So there's one potential positive for us.
A similar question was that because you mentioned that it may actually be your own body's autoimmune response that's causing these most severe damage. That there was mention that it may be actually that some of the DMTs actually rather than actually causing us major issues, may actually be beneficial. Is that the case?
So, yeah, no, I would caution to people to say, well, you shouldn't just change the DMT you're on because of a theoretical antiviral benefit. But so if we think about two specifically, interferons and fingolimod or galenia. So the interferons were initially designed as an antiviral treatment for hepatitis. So they have an intrinsic antiviral property, so they will naturally do that. And it seems as well that the fingolimod group or the S1P modulator group, so that's generally speaking fingolimod or siponimod, but that's not widely available, that they may also have an antiviral effect, and they are actually being investigated in a trial setting in China at the minute. But that said, many drugs are being investigated in trial settings, obviously, to try and find something that may be of benefit. So yes, there are potentially those specific classes of DMTs may have a benefit. That's a bonus if you're already taking one of them, but it wouldn't be grounds on its own for you to change DMT. And just on that point as well, there's a lot of I've seen a lot of people saying, well, what do I do if I'm on a DMT and I test positive for COVID-19? Do I stop my medication immediately? Well, again, that's difficult to answer because we simply don't know in huge numbers of people. But as a general rule, and I think this is sensible, I've seen it from a few sources, that you should not stop taking your DMT just because you have COVID-19. Remember that 80% of people will have a very mild self-limiting illness. The time when it's probably the stage where you should stop your medication is if you're developed a severe case and you're being hospitalized. I think at that stage, there's not huge peer-reviewed evidence to say this, but it makes sense that you probably, if things are that bad, you probably should stop your DMT. But remember that they all have a washout period. They don't disappear from your system overnight. So Tisabri takes 3 to 4 months to get out of your system. Fingolimod takes 6 to 8 weeks to get out of your system. And you also wouldn't stop your DMT just because you have a cold or flu. I've had the flu 2 or 3 times since I started MS medications, and I haven't stopped mine just for that. So you don't need to just stop your medication just because you test positive or you feel unwell. But if you get to the stage where you're needing hospitalization or further and more intensive treatments, at that stage it is probably worth stopping things. But again, if you're in any doubt, that's probably something that the medical teams need to be discussing on your behalf.
Okay. But there are some potential plus sides. So the vitamin D, potentially some of the immunomodulatory treatments. It's not all dark news for us necessarily.
No.
And so I just wanted to ask now, is there any other points that you think are worth discussing?
So I think in terms of what we can all do to prevent the disease, A, spreading, but us, B, contracting it ourselves. It comes from the World Health Organization, so this applies no matter where you live. The most important thing to do is to wash your hands frequently for 20 seconds or more at a time using warm water and soap. This is a virus that is contained within a little fatty envelope. Fat is broken down by soap. It is the most important thing that you can do. Washing your hands for 20 seconds or more frequently, or if you can't get access to soap and water and you can get access to hand sanitizer, which I know is also difficult at times, that's extremely, extremely important. It is the most important thing we can do. It cannot be overstated. Another thing that's really important is that we should, and it can be difficult, is avoid touching your hands to your face, to your nose, to your eyes, to your mouth, and keeping more than 1.5 to ideally 2 meters away from anybody who's not a direct family member who lives in your home. If you are coughing and sneezing, either do it into a tissue, which you then bin, or if you don't have a tissue on you, cough or sneeze into the crook of your elbow. That's absolutely vital to prevent the spread of this disease, as we've already touched on. It's extremely, extremely infectious. It's also worth mentioning that we think at the minute this is spread by droplets rather than in air itself, so it's not aerosolized. So the issue of face masks is one that's controversial. We saw in many of the Asian countries that it's almost part of normal culture for them, for many people in Asian countries, if they are traveling, to use a face mask anyway. But it was almost being, I think it was being government mandated at a time. So face masks now obviously are in very, very short supply. Generally speaking, they are not effective at preventing preventing you developing the disease, but they may prevent the spread of the disease. So the time when a face mask is appropriate actually is if you did need to go out and you think that you may have the coronavirus. You ideally should not be going out anyway if you think you have it. But it's the people who already have the coronavirus that should wear the mask rather than the people that are trying to not develop it, if that makes sense. And probably the final thing is that there are a couple of myths about coronavirus and what may or may not work as a treatment. So in the age of social media, you can get a huge amount of information, but you can get a lot of information without the appropriate context. One of the ones that you often see is about eating huge amounts of garlic. Well, actually, that's not been shown to be of any benefit in treating coronavirus. There is a growing market for something called colloidal silver, which is silver molecules in solution which you take. Again, there is no evidence for that, and that could be poisonous at a high dose. But one thing that has been slightly, I think, possibly misrepresented, and we're not 100% sure if it's truthful or not, is regarding ibuprofen, which is a common painkiller, often used for treating sort of simple aches and pains. There was some evidence, we think, in France that people who were doing worse or had more severe cases of coronavirus had been using ibuprofen. Then it came out saying actually that was all false. The current guidance in the United Kingdom, and I can't speak for other listeners around the world, but it would be worth checking whether or not you are recommended to take it, because at present in the United Kingdom we're saying you should probably just take paracetamol, or for our American listeners, acetaminophen, if you have pain or fever, and to avoid the ibuprofen at the minute. But that, as with many things, it's a developing situation, and it's worth keeping an eye on.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I think we've got some key guidance there, and also that we don't need to especially worry. We should certainly self-isolate. We should take all precautions.
Yes.
There are slight additional risks, but it's nothing we need to panic about as people with MS, whether we're on a disease-modifying therapy or not. And that if we're careful and sensible, then we can get through this as individuals, Absolutely. As nations, and as a global issue.
Yeah. As somebody once said, there's never a storm that didn't blow over. And whilst that seems trite and cliche at the minute, I'm really holding on to it, because at the time, this minute in time, things seem pretty dark. But the darker it is, the brighter the stars shine, and we're really seeing that. And I believe that we will, as a species, as humanity, we will get through this. It is a massive test, but we will get through it, and panicking about this will not help us achieve that goal. So please look after yourselves, look after your family, and look after your loved ones.
Right, so thank you very much for joining us again on the podcast. Hopefully next time you're on the podcast, it will be happier times.
Yeah, I look forward to it, Jeff. Thank you very much for having me back again.
With that, I would like to thank you all for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Remember that there is a wealth of information at overcomingms.org, including show notes and an archive of all Living Well with MS episodes. Once again, that's overcomingms.org. There you can also find OMS-friendly recipes and exercise tips, connect with other OMSers in your local area through our OMS Circles programme, and learn about the latest research going on in the MS world generally and related to OMS specifically. I encourage you to register on the site and stay informed about the latest news and updates. I also encourage you to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode, and please feel free to share it with others who might find it of value. Let us know what you think about the podcast by leaving a review, and if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you, so please contact us via our website overcomingms.org. Thanks again for listening and for joining me on this journey to overcoming MS and living well with multiple sclerosis. I'm Jeff Alex, and I'll see you next time.